Hello everyone, welcome to CYBR603 Learning Activity 14, and we're going to cover the standards views. The good news is standard views are much simpler. If we have the more complicated service views, which we just covered in Learning Activity 13, you'll be pleasantly surprised that this is going to be a much shorter lecture because standards views are simpler. By far one of the more simpler parts of DODAF. Standard views are just like they sound. They establish a set of rules and they use a set of standards, whether it be speaking nomenclature, whether they be network protocols or data protocols or any type of standard, testing standard, anything like that. It can be any standard. If your architecture has a standard, whether it's a cybersecurity standard, whether it's a network standard, whether it's a data standard, hardware, whatever it is, you can find a lot of those in the ISO. For example, if you're using a cybersecurity standard within your framework, right, whether it be the OV1 that you document that or anywhere else, and you're wanting to maintain a set of cybersecurity controls within a architecture, well, then you're going to more than likely you'll be using the ISO IEC 27001 and 27002. Those are kind of your baseline security controls and security standards documents as it relates to cybersecurity, information assurance, and all things in between. So that's an example. So that's what standards views do. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. That is what standards views do, and is they document the standards that your architecture is using. Okay. So another way to view the standards is that they cover the view of if we talked about TOGAF, TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework, that is more of a process-driven framework and less of a artifact-driven framework. DODAF being more artifact-driven is more what we're teaching here. There's a distinct difference between the two. But what's nice about the standards view does kind of take a little bit of what's called a TOGAF view of the world, in the sense that standards are something that exists across the operations, the business, the technical, and any other industry type of guidelines that exist out there. These can be NIST, National Institute of Standards. They can also be, like I'd mentioned earlier, ISO, International Standards Organization. So there's different standards bodies for different things. Like IEEE has standards. You might be using those as well. So to without further confusing and trying to actually clarify something, the Open Group Architectural Framework is something that views things from a business application and secure. Well, not so much security, but a very similar view to what we're seeing here in terms of like what business technical view of the world. Now, with that said, again, the standards models that we're talking about here are based on the DODAF concept and context. So I just want to just clarify that real quick. Okay. Next up, how many levels are there as it relates to the standards views? It's one of the simplest ones. So this is good. There's only 2 levels. You have a StdV1 and an StdV2. You got a profile and a forecast. Forecast is nice. They're both useful. They're both needed, but I would say for the purposes of what we're trying to build out, we just need to stick to a standards profiles, which is the current rules, not the future rules of all the activities and standards that are in use by services, actors, performers, and nodes and everything else that you might have within your integrated architecture. Your standards views should include at a minimum, and what is going to be required is for this week's submission is an StdV1, so just a standard standards profile. Okay. So here's a meta model. Again, reminder, this is not the actual model, this is the meta model. So it's the model that describes models. So in this case, what's in purple is pretty important. So the activity, the performer, and then any standards that are, any standards by which those activities are governed by. Okay. You probably want to see what this looks like. Well, here's an example. There are two primary examples for an StdV1. You have a lot of flexibility in a lot of these artifacts. They don't have to stick to exactly what is requested. These are kind of like guidelines. The idea is that these are flexible guides to allow you to give you a starting point, but also to extend them and scale on them as needed. In this case, the standards profile here is a simple human-computer interface standards, information modeling, financial data, web services. These are all pretty straightforward, and you can see the standard used there in the middle. This is more of a tabular form for an StdV1. I should say, let me rephrase it. It's more of an outline form of an StdV1. So there's another one that is more of a matrix, tabular matrix style, and this one also is a very similar in the sense that we're documenting the standards, but it's in this case it's a little bit more complicated, because what we're doing is we're listing out standards on the top, and then confirmation of those elements being used by a given standard. This is pretty straightforward to build in Excel. I mean, it's up to you in terms of which route you want to go, whether it's the outline form like this is fine, or something a little bit more complicated like this, which looks very similar to a racing matrix, except in this case it's just a yes or no on standards as it relates to an organizational element that is bound by that standard. Okay. The StdV1 is it delineates the system, services, standards, and rules that apply. Any technical standards. I talked about this a bit, whether that be hardware, software, and it's not even just the hardware, software. It's any type of technical standard that's even outside of hardware and software. Like it could be process oriented or human process oriented, like mitigation of threats regarding social engineering, right? There's a standard around that, and it's in the ISO handbooks. So the StdV1 would document what that ISO standard is for social engineering, as an example. So that's really what the intended usage of the StdV1 is for, to one, document the standards, but also to give people a better understanding that yes, what we've built and what we're working with does abide by a set of standards, and makes it can be then published for others to refer back to. Okay. The standards views, although they're not complicated, they have a large impact on a lot of other viewpoints, 3 in particular. So the system viewpoints, of course, the other services viewpoints, not all of them, but some of them, as well as the data viewpoints. So you can see that it's not just something that we just say, hey, here's some standards and throw them in a table and we're done. There also has to be some thought around, especially those top level SVCV1 and SV1. There has to be a little bit of thought put into where these standards would be referenced in other areas, in other artifacts. So the artifacts on the right have a direct tie to the standards view. So you want to kind of have a good feel for that, and that also means keep up on your readings. Okay, that's all I have here. Man, I did not get that. I missed that one too. 14, there we go. So this is a much shorter one. Make sure you're working on this, your SVCV1, StdV1, and then readings goes from 3776 to 379. We still have time, but don't get caught up in you don't want to get too caught up in being behind, because we have two assignments due this week. We got one assignment due next week, and then after that it starts to ease up from a submission perspective. But the reason we did that is you're going to take everything that you've put together up to this point, you're going to put it in a presentation, and you're going to present to us your moon-based architecture. So be prepped for that. Be on the lookout for that. And with that said, that is all I have for Learning Activity 14. As usual, if you have any questions, concerns, or general items that you want to discuss, feel free to give me a call or email. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and I will see you in next week's learning activities.